Thank you, Dima, for your kind words. I would like to welcome you all to the G20 Interfaith Forum. Our topic is inequality, gender, racism, and structural discrimination. Thank you all for joining us today from around the world. It is a great honor and privilege to be with you and with our distinguished speakers. We have with us today His Excellency Adama Jiang, former United Nations Special Advisor of the Secretary General of Genocide, Dr. Ganoon, the Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty at the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Maryland, USA, Ms. Adori, the Chair Board of Parliament of World Religion, Imam Yahya, who is joining us from Italy. He's the president of the Italian Islamic Religious Community, Ms. Asha, the Director of Human Rights Development Initiative from South Africa, Ms. Lisa, also Senior Human Rights Advisor from Norway, and Mr. Peter Prove, the Director of International Affairs at World Council of Churches. So, thank you for joining us today and welcome again. And before I start, I would like to tell you a story. Now, it's a short story. It's about a very successful surgeon who is married to the best kindergarten teacher you will ever meet. This nice couple went through a rough week. Their nice house was broken into 2 days ago. Unfortunately, a thief sneaked in while the couple was out. Luckily, their security system alerted the police. Officers arrived very fast and were able to arrest the thief on the crime scene. The criminal is a repeated offender with a long history of violent crimes and drug abuse. The couple are safe, but before I can tell you more about that story, I want to talk about a concept that probably you heard about before. It's called the butterfly effect. It's basically a small localized change in a complex system that can have a large effect elsewhere. So something really small someone can do that can lead to a big difference. So when you think about, what the butterfly effect has to do with this story, I would like to ask you a few questions. When you were listening to this story, and probably some images came to your mind, imagining the character, can you think about or could you reflect on what gender was the surgeon? Did you think it was male? What if I said the surgeon was female? What about the kindergarten teacher? What gender? What race? How about the criminal? What images came to your mind? How did you see him? What about the cubs? So, gender and race is always there. It's in our language, it's in our thoughts, it's something we have to deal with. And when you think about structural and systemic racism and discrimination, it can be very overwhelming. But when we apply the butterfly effect principle, we learn how to survive the system instead of being victimized by it. So, what small steps can you take today to do your part in making our world better? How can we all be more self-challenging and changing instead of blaming and criticizing. Because change, says in the holy book Quran, starts from within. إن الله لا يغير ما بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم. God will not change the condition of a group until they change what within themselves. So, if I may suggest something to think about, one word: mindfulness. Mindfulness is a state of being in the present moment, stepping away from your judgmental thoughts, from your personal biases and preferences. Just being more present, less judgmental. And mindfulness will allow us to be more self aware. When you reflect on another verse in the Holy Book, Quran says, "Inna ba'da dhanni ithm." Some assumptions are sinful. And you will think, how could an assumption be sinful? Who am I hurting? It's just a thought, it's just a word, something in my head. But if you believe in the butterfly effect, you'll understand that words has power. My 4-year-old, you always say, words have power, words have power. So when we reflect on, ourselves and what we can do to improve ourselves, be honest and self-aware with our own prejudices, biases, and acknowledge our human struggle, which will allow us to create this beautiful butterfly effect by changing one thought and being more mindful, stepping away from a negative thinking into a positive thinking. That's a move in the right direction. Hopefully, with that, I will move to the introduction of our first speaker, His Excellency Adama Dieng he's from Senegal, and he's the former United Nations Secretary General and Special Advisor on Prevention of Genocide. Mr. and Your Excellency, Mr. Adama Dieng, if you can start with your remark, and then I will follow up with discussion and question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nawal. I hope you hear me.
Loud and clear.
You do. Okay. Let me outset really commend the leadership of the G20 Interfaith Forum, KAICIID Dialogue Center, UNAOC, and NCIRD in bringing to fruition this important program. And I should say that our responsibility is to look how do we remove barriers that reinforce vulnerability, that reinforce the inequality, discrimination on gender, race, etc., while creating the necessary tool and space so that those perceived as vulnerable who are victims of discrimination today can become fully powerful agents of positive change. And I shall come back to this scope. But let me say that we are facing really a turning point in the history of our humanity. I mean, we all know that the year 2020 has clearly proved itself as an eventful year with the apparition and the advent of a novel form of a coronavirus. Our world is out. Our world is suffering. Our world is on hold while millions are infected and hundreds of thousands are dying in what I would call a silent death of lives cut short in almost full anonymity, if not the daily numbers of deaths reported. Our world is also facing one of the most severe economic depression since the last 300 years, worse than the 1929 economic crisis. The numbers and data in the fight against this invisible enemy sadly speak for themselves. And I will simply mention two. Over 243 million women and girls aged between 15 and 49 have been subjected to sexual and or gender-based violence perpetrated by an intimate partner in the last 12 months. And the poverty levels are expected to rise to 500 million people, reverting communities into extreme poverty. So in this context, inequality and structural discrimination continue to entrench not only into the fabric of our societies, but also challenges the universality of human rights systems, which international community has painstakingly built over half a century. It is therefore crucial that this kind of conversation we are having today merit our focus to explore ways and means of reaffirming our collective humanity premise on the recognition of the indivisibility of human rights regardless of our race, gender, or any other identifying attribution. The discrimination that certain groups, such as women, ethnic or racial minorities, and migrants, face in the labor market makes them highly vulnerable to exploitation and abuses such as forced labor and human trafficking. And barriers to decent jobs often compel parents belonging to an ethnic minority to resort to labor of their children to make ends meet. And though discrimination can have many manifestations, it is often subtle and insidious, undermining people's dignity and their future. Discrimination and inequality deprive people of their voice and their ability to fully, I would say, enjoy their rights. I should say that freedom from discrimination is a fundamental human right and is essential for individuals to choose, for instance, their employment freely, to develop their potential to the full, and to reap economic rewards on the basis of merit. Bringing equality and access to the workplace and employment opportunities has significant economic benefits. The profits of a globalized economy are more fairly distributed in a society with equality, leading to a greater social stability and broader public support for further economic development. Gender equality and non-discrimination feature prominently in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And as reflected in the SDGs, which member states have committed to realize in the next decade to address inequality and structural discrimination, our societies must commit to build and advance inclusive growth, leaving no one behind. An inclusive society is one that rises above differences of race, gender, class, generation, and geography to ensure equality of opportunity, regardless of racial or social origin. In an inclusive society, social interaction is governed by an agreed set of institutions, of social institutions, and the capability of all citizens to determine how those institutions function and relate to their day-to-day life is indeed a hallmark of an inclusive society. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, let me simply say that faith-based organizations and religious leaders are equipped with faith, courage, and vision to play a unique role in responding to the crisis and in supporting the creation of the necessary tools and spaces I referred earlier, so that those perceived as victims of discrimination, they could then become fully powerful agent of positive change. Defining our path forward also will include urgent measures to use all relevant tools, including innovation and new technology, to rebuild our humanity. And I have in mind use of new technology and application to reduce health risk, the economic and social exclusion of women, minimizing the impact of COVID on our social fabric. And finally, last word, it is my hope that by the end of this forum, we will leave not only with inspiration and concrete recommendations, but also with the strength and courage to deliver for and with the people, particularly women and youth, who have long already started taking action. And here I want once again to really commend the organizers and in particular to praise my brother and good friend, Dr. Faisal bin Omar, and to reiterate my full support to the entire program of the Interfaith Global Forum. I thank you. Over to you, Nawal.
Your Excellency, if I may ask you a quick question, and I know it's like we're really pressed for time, but can you tell me maybe in 1 minute, how can we learn from your experience in the genocide prevention, some of the intervention that we can apply to prevent or to deal with the structural racism and systemic discrimination? Your Excellency, I'm not able to hear you.
Sorry for that. I was first thanking you for this opportunity to address the issue of prevention. And I always say that we need to do more when it comes to prevention. Many governments around the world, they do state publicly that they support prevention. But when it comes to really put the hand in the pocket and to support initiatives into prevention, they are very reluctant. And that is why I say it is a collective responsibility. And in this regard, I really praise the FBOs and the religious leaders who have accompanied me in my past life in trying to mobilize support for prevention. And when we speak about the prevention, for instance, of mass atrocities, what do we used to call atrocity crimes, meaning genocide, crimes against humanity, war crime, ethnic cleansing, I tend to make the comparison with preventing disease within our own family. And I said we should do the same, but as a society, to look into the risk factors, because you all know that genocide is a process. It does not happen overnight. It requires planning, it requires resources. I mean, I can refer to the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda, the 100 days of madness. We all should have been ready from the first signs. Just take, for instance, the Radio de Mille Collines, the hate speech which was spreading already, to take action, but we failed. And as a matter of fact, it is because of that failure of the international community, the failure also of religious leaders, even in Rwanda, with few exceptions, that my office, my mandate was established. Over to you.
Right. Well, really helpful, Your Excellency, and I think that will allow us to probably discuss it furthermore towards the end of this panel, hopefully, to discuss it further. I would like to give a chance to our speaker, Ganoon Diop, the Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty of the Seventh Day Adventist Church from Maryland, USA, to please go ahead and start his speech, and then we can come back to the panel discussion. Dr. Diop for joining us today, and look forward to hearing your take on this very important topic.
Thank you very much. And I also thank the organizers of this G20 Interfaith Forum, distinguished leaders, and highly valued participants to this timely session. The challenges of our era have been compared to the events of the 1850s. Then, it seemed almost impossible to obtain the abolition of slavery. Today, one of the main predicaments we face as international community is the abolition of inequality and inequity. I will focus on the issue of racism and its various manifestations, forms, and expressions. Of course, I could specify here that the scope of our topic could extend to tribalism, ethnocentrism, casteism, classism, and other forms of supremacist ideologies. The main reflection I would like to submit to your consideration is the fundamental issue which undergirds the reality of discrimination. And that is, in fact, the measure of our humanity. And the title of this short presentation is The Measure of Our Humanity. What is at stake, and one of the most pressing questions, is the understanding and hopefully adoption of what it means to be human. Archbishop Rowan Williams insightfully expressed these problematic as follows, and I quote, "If there is one great challenge for our day, it is the pervasive sense that we are in danger of losing our sense of the human," unquote. What does it mean to be human? Restrictive definitions limit the answers to these fundamental questions to the issue of belonging to a particular group, whether tribal, ethnic, cultural, or religious. But dehumanization of others takes the trajectory of exclusion from a construct. In fact, an arbitrary, non-universal norm one chooses to believe and to elevate to the status of reference of how to view and measure others. From this premise, humans are theoretically and practically subjected to valuing, segmenting, and dividing into racial categories and even castes and classes. The truth of one humanity. The UNESCO statement of 1950s was a landmark statement to debunk the foundation of racist theories. And it stated at the outset that, I quote, "Scientists have reached general agreement in recognizing that mankind is one, that all men belong to the same species, Homo sapiens." And of course, one could mention the United Nations Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, ratified in 1963. And I quote here, "It solemnly affirms the necessity of speedily eliminating racial discriminations throughout the world in all its forms and manifestations, and of securing understanding of and respect for the dignity of the human person. Convinced that any doctrine of superiority based on racial differentiation is scientifically false, morally condemnable, socially unjust and dangerous, and that there is no justification for racial discrimination in theory or practice anywhere." Interesting, the statement concludes with these following words: "The existence of racial barriers is repugnant to the ideals of any human society." Now, that is the current verdict of the world, but here there is a gap between the ideal and the real. Practically, the measure of our humanity is tested by how we view and relate to other human beings. The current reckoning against racism challenges ancient practices based on violence against other human beings. The questions which compel us to think more carefully about the true embrace of the reality of one humanity actually are the following. Are they justifications for hierarchical segmenting, valuing of human beings? Are there stratifications and divisions of are rather stratifications and divisions of humanity between superiors and inferiors legitimate? What about the construct of racial superiority or inferiority, which nurtures most racist and supremacist ideologies? These segmenting and valuing are accompanied with contempt and disdain of human beings deemed inferior. Now, the root cause of much senseless suffering, dehumanizing practices of discriminating against human beings is the legitimization of violence and the demeaning and trampling of human dignity. These toxic legitimizations have a tendency to creep into instrumentalization, even of religions, for conquest, colonization, empire building, and annexations of people, lands, and resources. Now, when it comes specifically to racism and discrimination against so called people of color and black people in particular, no region of the world has been immune from being a theater of discrimination and, even worse, criminalization of others who do not belong because not conform to an adopted norm. Police brutality is one of the expressions of a culture of subjugation expressed in the knee on the neck of George Floyd, for example, and in too many regions of the world. Access to leadership position and media representation is overwhelmingly based on skin color. In many parts of the world, the ever-present testimony of black people is to be subjected to a culture of contempt and disdain, cover up with a widespread conspiracy rather, and culture of silence. There must be a better humanity. Human cultural distinctives, instead of being highlighted as a richness and welcomed as a blessed diversity of the human family, often sideline and stifle the values of brotherhood and sisterhood and equality, and actually present in all world religions. This fraternity of all humankind is affirmed unequivocally in all monotheistic religions and other religious traditions. Now, that is a heuristic intersection, a most welcome overlapping consensus. At the same time, when at their worst, religion have displayed contempt, hatred, even murderous intent towards people who do not belong to their fold. Now, in several religious traditions, and that is also part of the issue, black people are relegated to second-class citizens, deprived of the recognition of full humanity. And this biased perception of black people is framed by the lingering memory of various slaveries. I mean, of course, starting with the trans-Saharan slavery, the Oriental slaveries through Zanzibar and Mombasa, then in the 15th century, the infamous transatlantic slavery, and of course, the intra-Africa slavery, which was current and orchestrated from Africa. To add wounds to injuries, the current reports of domestic servitudes, abuses rather of black people and people of color add to the toll of humiliation and suffering, especially of women trapped in being treated as objects and commodities and chattels. The common denominator of all these crimes against humanity is the belief in the inferiority of black people, divinely mandated, by the way, or and as in the so-called mythical curse of Ham, a text of the Bible which has been wrongly interpreted and used by antebellum Christian slave traders to promote the necessity of the subjugation of black people. We are not here to shame and blame, but rather to appeal to the best of the people, the best of people of goodwill, to the best of human tradition, which can help restore people from various trauma of being abducted, subjugated, despised, and abused. Affirming people's humanity
And Dr.
as we
Diab,
naturally
I'm
do.
sorry for, if I may, sorry for interrupting you, Dr. Diab.
Sure,
We have 1 more minute to go. So just want
sure.
to bring that to your attention, Dr. Diab, and I'm sorry, my apologies for the interruption.
No, no worry, no worries at all. I will then go to my conclusion to say that it could be that we at the G20 Interfaith Forum could walk a new path, be catalysts of a new journey on which we would all be determined to affirm the human dignity of every person. And also, may this conversation, dialogue, rapprochement in the dignity of difference usher a better world for all, a world in which all people of goodwill are determined to respect every human being. May policies be crafted to protect the full humanity of every person, and the reality of anti-racism must reach the chambers of lawmakers around the world in every country, so that the human family everywhere be related to with dignity and respect. But beyond legal considerations, ruling and policies, human solidarities, compassion, mercy, love should be what animate us deep within the chambers of our conscience as we embrace more human and humane ways to relate to one another, regardless of skin color, place of origin, gender, or position in society. To conclude, I will say this. Ultimately, the best measure of our humanity is love. And there is a foundational correlation which exists between relating to God and relating to humans. In fact, this is present in most world religions. And I can just say, in this perspective, love is the ultimate test of our humanity. It is actually the ultimate and best sign of our humanity. So may it bind us into one human family, all related through this divine virtue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This is really inspiring. I love, especially when you talked about love and how it's what unites us together. And we really need to hear more the message on love and how we can find healing through that. Now, my question is to you, Dr. Diop. You mentioned that representation is essential. Could you please, in 2 minutes, talk about how can representation be helpful? Why is it important? And what are basically the measures that should be taken by governments and also people to ensure that representation is being addressed and practiced?
Representation is an expression of respect and dignity of others. Uh, as I was saying earlier, the valuing, the segmenting, the hierarchicalization of society has, since colonial time, framed institutions in such a way that minorities have actually always being in position, I mean, in lower position and positions of subjugations and so forth. So if racism is systemic, right, and structural and institutional, to dismantle racism, it is necessary to rethink how human beings are viewed, and not only just from the perspective of best wishes, but also welcome into structures of leadership, structures of participation in the common good, so that equality may be a reality. This is not just a matter of the abolition of slavery, obtained in the early, in the latter part of the 19th century, but rather a question of equality and equity, and also the respect, deep disrespect of the sacredness and the importance of every human being. Until we start looking at every person as deserving honor, respect, and dignity, then we will continue to instrumentalize people and put some as superior, others as inferior. And I think we need to today have mobilized to have access to a new humanity. We can live better than what is going on around the world, every region of the world where some people are looked down upon.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Diop. This is really very insightful, and that actually a very good way to transition to our next speaker, Ms. Audrey Keteagua, the chair of board of the Parliament of the World's Religion. Please, Ms. Keteagua, if you can start with your remarks, and just considering the time, I will hold on the questions all the way to the end of the panel discussion. Once all speakers finish their speaks, then we can come back and ask questions to make sure that we have time, since we only have 2 hours today.
Thank you so much, Nawal. And it is my privilege to be with all of you today and to also thank the organizers as well as participants of this G20 Interfaith Forum conference. And I wanted to address how can religious communities contribute to solving problems of racial injustice, since His Excellency Ademaden indicated that this is to be also a discussion about concrete actions that faith-based organizations can take to address racial injustice. So I would like to begin by sharing about a joint effort between the Parliament of the World's Religions, Religions for Peace, United Religions Initiative, and the Interfaith Center of New York. In June 2020, they issued jointly a statement for a call for action and an open invitation to others to join. So this indicates the cooperative engagement now between faith-based organizations, which I think is an extremely important paradigm to start modeling by all people as well as by all organizations as well as governments. So in recognition that there are many people who are committing their time, their resources, and passion in supporting activities that they perceive can make a positive difference in the world. So this is a tremendous resource of goodwill that already exists. And the call sets forth 8 action items, which I really want to share with you because it was created with a great deal of thought and consideration in mind. And these 8 action items give specific ways in which religious communities can contribute to solving problems of racial injustice. And the call indicates, number 1, to pray and act together for our shared future, knowing that we are called to love our neighbor. And this goes to exactly the point that Ganun was speaking about, love as a test of our humanity. And secondly, to address racism in our society and acknowledge our complicity in it in all of its insidious forms. And this is important to take us out of denial as a methodology by which we can start to deconstruct our solidified thinking processes and open our lens into the bigger global lens that includes the other. So this also includes visible participation in nonviolent protests, calling out racial injustices, and problem solving and partnering with affected communities which we lead. So number 3 is to ask our local and regional law enforcement and political leadership to immediately cease all forms of violence against nonviolent protesters, and that nonviolent and non-lethal means to be employed in addressing the behavior of rogue actors committing violence. And this is another very important principle, and that is the principle of nonviolence, or as we would say in some communities, ahimsa. It is a very important spiritual concept and practice. Number 4 is to call upon local and state governments to facilitate the means for constructive, nonviolent protests to continue to take place. And we call for them to investigate the injury or death of any persons participating in the protests or rioting. And number 5, to use our voices to speak up, not only for racial justice and the economic justice it necessitates, but also against the militarization and authoritarian use of our law enforcement. And we have to be able to trust that the rule of law is applied fairly and equitably to all parties, else it is not the rule of law. Number 6 is to call upon people of faith to educate themselves about the very real impacts of racism and to understand and sojourn with movements led by persons of color for justice, equality, and equity. So these are very powerful words that you will hear throughout our conversation today because these words are packed with great meaning. And it is always to bring the consciousness into a unified field of this oneness in which we all exist. Number 7 is to support efforts at diversity, equity, and inclusion in our places of worship, workplaces, and lives. And number 8 is to encourage volunteerism and philanthropic commitments to institutions working to advance racial justice and harmony. And Father Emmanuel Klapsis, who is a professor of theology at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology, said these very important words. The systemic nature of racism, violence, and injustice requires a long-form response effort that will span generations. And even if the moral indignation subsides, and attention of the mass media has shifted to other matters, though they should not be shifted, faith communities must continue to pray with their feet and hands and work together to resolve the insidious impacts of the ugly legacy of slavery, the blight of racism, and the multiple forms of discrimination in our communities. The religious communities would give credence to their joint vision of an inclusive society by advocating the changes not only in the society, but also in their internal life by supporting efforts at diversity, equity, and inclusion in their own places of worship, workplaces, and lives. And there are many wonderful coalitions being mobilized in many, many sectors and communities. And this is the work of faith-based organizations on the ground that is very important for us to learn about, know about, and to also replicate the wonderful models of bringing together communities of faith to address these types of problems, which really are so complicated that it is virtually impossible for any one person, any one group, any one government or organization to address alone. So these kinds of coalitions that are coming together in many faith-based organizations in communities are important for us to study because together as a collective, they are able to address these important issues of racism while they simultaneously turn that searchlight inward within themselves as individuals, within organizations, and especially as faith-based groups to really profoundly study our own mindsets, attitudes, and aspects within ourselves that need to be changed so that we can truly become fully human in the great meaning of what it is to have the sacred gift of life. Thank you.
Very much, Ms. Ketegawa. I really appreciate your remark, especially talking about the role of nonviolence. This is very helpful. And that actually will lead us to our next speaker, Imam Yahya Balaviccini, who's the president of the Italian Islamic religious community. Imam Yahya, you got the mic.
Thank you very much, and hello and welcome to everybody. And I'm very glad to share this with such a distinguished panel and colleagues. And also, I'd like to thank KAICIID among the organizers for the great work in organizing also this Interfaith Forum within the G20 in engagements and inspirational points to be suggested at an institutional level. I was very actually happy and surprised with our moderator Nawal mentioning on the butterfly effect, because actually this is a very interesting vision on how through a small effort we might each one together be able to change something within ourselves and together also in the outer world, and to face in a wise way the challenges and be inspired by methodologies that can actually be always much more efficient in the challenges that are changing. So I think this you have helped us to go to the point. And of course, as a Muslim believer, I like to quote also two teachings of our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because on one side he mentioned that there is no superiority for an Arab over a non-Arab, or for a non-Arab over an Arab, neither for a white to be superior over the black, or the black to be superior over the white, except by piety. And the name for this is taqwa. And so there is a teaching for the Muslim community, for the believers, for all creatures, to rather engage in piety and not to consider some external diversities as occasions to pretend a superiority or to be involved in a discrimination. So I think this is, on one side, something that can help us as a universal teaching. But on the other side, there is another teaching of the Prophet ﷺ, when he says that differences in my community are a blessing. So, if I may say, the point I want to stress in this short presentation is that on one side, we should respect diversities. We should acknowledge and understand that each human being is different from one to the other. But in this diversity, we are in some way also united. We are united as members of a common family, but also we are united in terms of a spiritual dimension towards our common Lord. And to discover the relation between each of us is to discover the richness of diversity, which is not the discrimination of inequality. It is to engage in justice and not to pretend to be superior one to the other, in somehow making a speculation on an instrumentalization or an abuse on a particular quality or identity as something that could be better than the other. So there is this intellectual tension, there is this intellectual challenge that we need to face together in order to discover the common richness and discover the quality of diversity as something that helps us to be and consistent with the responsibility of being pious. Now, how this theological or spiritual or brotherly engagement can be implemented in social challenges? Well, this is probably the new skills that are requested for theologians, for religious leaders, to engage and change interreligious dialogue in interreligious cooperation focused on specific challenges that are unfortunately attacking our communities, but our common society and humanity. So, in order to understand how to become and behave as brothers, we need to discover where are the problems of that are in somehow preventing us to recognize each other as a brother and as a sister. And this is where the new engagement of interreligious dialogue and cooperation is needed to be focused and skilled and prepared and trained on specific areas where, according to some narratives, a gender disequality or a discrimination against women or men or a believer or a non-believer or a citizen or a migrant is in somehow something that pretends to be a narrative due to the diversity. And the religious leaders need to show on one side what is a commonality, what unites us, and on the other side, how to respect the diversity without any confusion and any syncretism. So I think this is actually our main engagement because intellectually and psychologically we can help citizens to be fully citizens in the West as well as in the East and respect the rules and respect the rights, but also respect each identity according to our spiritual and religious dimension and belonging. And in the same time, respect the diversity of religions as well as the diversity of rules of citizenship in the different context of the East or the West of each country in Europe as well as elsewhere. And concluding with a remark from Europe, I like to remember the work KAICIID has somehow facilitated and coordinated with the document for the G20 Interfaith Forum from the regional European consultation on empowering people and fostering gender equality. You can find it, of course, within the documents that have been provided by the organization. And as a person that has been sharing this engagement, I feel that in this document there are guidelines on how to implement our sensitivity, our training, and our engagement as responsible citizens and believers and leaders for this small changement, as you were mentioning, that might have a butterfly effect, but at least might also help us to learn what is the deep richness of piety and what is the deep richness of mercy and brotherhood in the diversity of humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Imam Yahya Balaviccini, President of CORES, the Italian Islamic religious community, for your remark. Definitely, diversity is something that we need to celebrate and we need to embrace. And probably this is also a perfect transition to our next speaker, Ms. Asha, the Director of Human Rights Development Initiative from South Africa. Ms. Asha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Madam Moderator. Thank you so much, Nawal. And thank you so much, KAICIID, for inviting me to this very, very, very timely forum. Let me begin by reflecting a bit on a discussion that was held on Tuesday during a panel discussion on human trafficking and modern slavery. We heard there about how greed and money lie at the heart of this very evil system. And as I listened, I actually thought that human trafficking and modern day slavery are quite awful, evil systems. But, and this is an interesting but, the fact that we get to see a face, we get to see the horror, makes it a bit easier to actually deal with. But the system that lies beneath human trafficking, the economic system, which is the evil that actually facilitates and bolsters human trafficking, is much more complex, much more difficult. And we will see that it has a gender, race, and social cohesion dimension. So I plan on focusing today on that economic system that basically keeps all these other evils alive. So, but let me take a step back before going into that to tell you a little bit about what I've done. In my early days as a lawyer, I provided free legal services to people who couldn't afford private lawyers. And more recently, I worked on access to justice for people living with HIV in East Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, and the Great Lakes region. And one of the issues that we advocated and the arguments that we made during this particular project and program for the last 15 years actually was that the right to health is not just about access to medication and access to health care, but it is also fundamentally about access to clean water, sanitation, housing, shelter, food. And as COVID-19 has made it so clear to us that these underlying determinants of the right to health, as the UN Human Rights Committee has pronounced, are fundamental. Governments at that time argued, and they still argue, and they ask the question, where do you expect us to get the money from? How are we going to fund all these fancy rights that you're talking about? And we, as human rights activists, often concluded that it was the big men, the big women in Africa, the elite, who were basically robbing us, ordinary people, of our rights. That might be part of the picture, but it's not the full picture by any stretch of our imagination. We now know from studies and as a fact that both the developing and the developed world lose much more money through what's called illicit financial flows, particularly through commercial transactions, commercial tax evasion, tax avoidance, profit shifting, trade misinvoicing, and other commercial activities than through corruption. Much more. In fact, the Thabo Mbeki high-level panel estimate that of the money that Africa loses, between 3 to 5% is lost by corruption, whereas 60 to 65% of the funds that we lose in Africa is lost through these kinds of commercial activities. So as I learned about how corporations, large corporations, multinational corporations on this continent manipulate invoices and manipulate their transactions to demonstrate high profits in low tax jurisdictions and low profits in high tax jurisdictions. Gandhi's words came to mind and have stuck in my mind, I have to say, since I've been working on this issue. And that is, he said, and I quote, all amassing of wealth or hoarding of wealth above and beyond one's legitimate needs is theft. There would be no occasion for theft if there was wise regulation of wealth and social justice. I would like to suggest that it is precisely because we do not have wise regulation of wealth in both in our individual countries and at the global level. It is because there's an absence of this wise regulation that such theft is even possible. The UN Conference on Trade and Development also tells us that the inordinate levels of inequality that we see in our world today is because of a phenomenon that they describe as hyperglobalization. This is an extreme form of globalization where financial and currency markets are deregulated in a way that it makes it possible for corporations and wealthy individuals to hide trillions of US dollars untaxed in tax havens. But more than hiding wealth, tax havens also help people escape other rules. They help you launder money, hide money from partners or spouses, hide proceeds of crimes such as human trafficking, and engage in other shady deals. But let me now return to the overall theme and look at how this system entrenches inequality and perpetuates gender discrimination. In a study that ActionAid undertook in Ghana some time back, a few years ago, they found that a woman, a small informal trader who basically sells beer, effectively paid more tax than SAB Miller, the Accra subsidiary of SAB Miller, that the multinational that actually produces the beer. How was this anomaly possible? It's because SAB Miller reflected a loss in their books 2 years for 2 years running. The government of Ghana at some point decided that they need to actually review their taxation system. And what they did was, instead of addressing corporate taxation, they decided to focus on the informal sector. This resulted in many women who form the majority of the informal sector being ending up paying much more tax than a multinational that actually produces the goods that they are selling. Further, a smaller tax base affects a government's ability to provide social services. The consequence of this is that women and children, particularly the girl child, are forced to take on more responsibilities around caregiving, unpaid work again. But over and above that, what governments have been doing, because they lose revenue through illicit financial flows, what governments have been doing is increasing value added tax, VAT tax, consumption tax, which are regressive taxes that end up impacting more on informal traders and consequently women. And finally, the taxation system, when it's designed around a male breadwinner sort of model, it affects a woman's participation in the labor force and then further entrenches the economic inequality between men and women in society. But let me now turn a little to social cohesion and particularly to issues of security and peace and security. Studies have shown,
Miss Asha, can you hear me?
I'm already almost out of time. Yes. Hi, I'm here.
Yes, I was trying to give you a heads up about the minute. We're out of time. Is it possible to finish these
Yes,
remarks toward the end of the
yes,
discussion if we
yes,
still have
yes,
time?
yes.
Thank you
Okay.
so much. I really
I'm,
enjoyed your talk, and thank you.
have you given me a minute, right?
I probably have delayed in our
To round
communication.
up.
We talked. Can you finish your remarks towards the end of the discussion if we still have time?
You would like me to stop right now?
If possible.
Okay, well,
Miss Asha,
let me
you
just,
can go for one
yes.
more minute. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So
Yeah, she's the timekeeper.
let me just say this, that I will not deal with the issue of security right now, but let me just say this, that we are living in a time where the boundaries of what's considered acceptable corporate conduct has been stretched to its limits. But what has this got to do with race, gender, and structural discrimination? And what I am submitting is that the underlying economic inequality that arises from the use of tax havens deepens the divide. And that it is my view that if we are going to rebuild our common home better, we need to address this head on. I would like to end this part of my submission not with my words, but with the words of Pope Francis, where he says, the fragility of world systems in the face of the pandemic has demonstrated that not everything can be resolved by market freedom. It has also shown us that in addition to recovering a sound political life that is not subject to the dictates of finance, We must put human dignity back at the center, and on that pillar, build the alternative social structures we need. I'm going to just finally say that addressing economic inequality will, in the long run, help us address the social inequalities that women and people of color face in the world. Thank you.
Miss Asha, I really appreciate your discussion. Sorry for the interruption. I have a timekeeper, to remind me of the time. But definitely, you raised very important point from your experience as an attorney, as you said, for 30 years, working on this matter and discussing the importance the money plays in these problems. So thank you very much. I hope we have more time to ask you further questions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Lisa Winter, Senior Human Rights Advisor from Norway. Ms. Lisa, thank you for your patience.
Thank you. And first of all, I would also like to thank the
So,
organizers
Ms.
for
Lisa,
the
I'm
invitation.
not able to hear you.
I have my mic unmuted. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you very well. Lisa, go
Good.
ahead. Nawal, I
So
hope all is good at your end.
First of all, I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to this distinguished panel that is gathered today to discuss and reflect upon very important issues, how to combat inequalities in different forms. And I have humbly accepted the invitation, knowing the great deal of knowledge and experience among my co-panelists. I've chosen to call my intervention Freedom of Religion or Belief, an enemy or ally in our strive for gender equality. Despite the great vision of the UN Sustainable Development Goals of leaving no one behind, we know that millions of women and girls are often among those furthest behind and most marginalized. They're facing numerous obstacles in having their rights materialized and in achieving equal opportunities, both within society at large and within religious communities themselves. And we have become used to recognize how patriarchal structures, norms, and traditions, both cultural and religious, discriminate against women. And we often view religion as an outside force that needs to be combated. Therefore, we often assume that religion is a hindrance to women's emancipation and empowerment. And wrongly thinking that the right to freedom of religion or belief will strengthen discriminating religious practices, we incorrectly conclude that this right is incompatible with gender equality. But I would like to use the coming few minutes to argue that we, in any meaningful and purposeful approach to women's empowerment, actually benefit from having a lens of freedom of religion belief, often shortened as FORB. This intersection between freedom of religion or belief and gender equality is overlooked, and thus resulting in blind spots and protection gaps and not giving women the agency that they deserve. I would like to highlight 3 areas linked to this intersection between FORB and gender equality that is important to be aware of when we strive to empower women and combat gender-based inequalities. And when I'm talking about FORB, I refer to the definition in Article 18 in the UDHR and the ICCPR, containing the right to adopt a religion or belief of your own choice, including the right to change your religion or belief, and the right to manifest and express your religion or belief, alone or together with others, in private and in public. My first point is that we need to take into account women's experiences of religiously based discrimination and FORB violations of freedom, religion, belief, when we work for gender equality. Because women are often affected differently than men. And in many cases, women are doubly vulnerable because of the multi-layered discrimination they already suffer from, based on both their gender and their religious and belief identities, and other factors such as ethnicity, age, and social status. Adding a FORB lens helps us to understand these challenges better and the role that their religious and belief identities plays in this. For example, the body and religiosity of women are often viewed as the gateway to harm an entire religious minority by, for example, abduction and forced marriage and forced conversion of girls and women within this minority. In addition, women are often bearing the honor of their religious community, and are therefore harassed both for wearing and not wearing the religious clothing that the majority deems morally acceptable. Another example could be that female converts and female religious dissidents risk sexual abuse as a way to try to pressure them back into the expected norm. And these types of violations and discriminations are just as important as other gender inequalities that we wish to combat. The second point is that freedom of religion and belief has an empowering aspect, enabling women to be agents in their own life when it comes to religion and belief. FORB, or freedom of religion and belief, does not give discriminating religious structures more power over women, but rather gives women the same rights as men to think freely, to make their own choices regarding religion or belief, and to practice these choices without fear of being discriminated, harassed, and punished, even if they break with social and religious norms. Religion is an important part of the lives of millions of women, and freedom of religion and belief gives them the right to choose what this part will look like. And when we are working for gender equality, we should not forget this aspect. My last point is that since FORB, freedom of religion and belief, enables different religious views and interpretations to exist alongside each other, it also creates the necessary space for voices advocating for greater gender equality and change, both within religious communities themselves and in the society at large. Together with freedom of expression, FORB contributes to healthy debates regarding structures that discriminate and oppress women, including harmful practices that might be religiously motivated or at least claim to be. Freedom of religion or belief can therefore play a crucial role in the improvement of gender equality. It is important to note, though, that some women may wish to work for greater gender equality from within their own religious tradition and not through abandoning religion. And this, of course, needs to be respected. To sum up, I've tried to highlight the importance of the intersection between gender equality and freedom of religion belief when finding meaningful approaches to promote women's empowerment. And I've mentioned 3 points. The first is that we need to take into account women's experiences of religiously based discrimination and violations of freedom of religion belief when working for women's rights, because women are often affected differently than men. My second point is that instead of dismissing freedom of religion belief as something that will give patriarchal religious structures greater power over women, we need to see how freedom of religion belief actually empowers women to be agents in their own lives, also in the religious sphere. And my last point is that freedom of religion or belief creates the necessary space for healthy debates regarding discriminating and oppressing religious structures. And thus, freedom of religion belief can enable needed change. With a greater awareness of this intersectionality, I believe we are better equipped to find purposeful approaches in our strive to reach all those women and girls that are still left behind and empower them with equal rights and opportunities. Thank you for your attention.
I'm finally able to hear you, and that was really good. So thank you so much, Ms. Lisa Winter. I enjoyed listening to your points, and definitely the religious beliefs can be a tool to help empower women and improve our society. And with that, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Peter Proof, Director of International Affairs at World Council of Church, WCC. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Thank you to the co-organizers of this forum, to my fellow panelists, and to all of you who are participating in this discussion. Well, they say that confession is good for the soul. And so I'm going to start in that manner. While acknowledging the extraordinary potential of religious values for overcoming injustice, I want to start by acknowledging that religious communities and institutions have been a major part of the problem in terms of structural inequalities of many types, especially, but not only, with regard to gender. A 2015 Christian Buddhist conference on religion, gender, sexuality, and power, jointly organized by the WCC and the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, explored in depth how issues around religion and gender interact with social, economic, psychological, and political factors to produce inequalities and injustices at multiple levels. Addressing the difficult question of the complicity of religions in not addressing gender inequality sufficiently, participants in the conference raised the question of engaging in a critical and contextual reading and interpretation of the scriptures, affirming that any interpretation of scripture, tradition, and culture that breeds violence, hatred, or disdain should be rejected. In a similar confessional vein, a recent document titled Serving a Wounded World in Interreligious Society, jointly produced by the WCC and the Vatican, reiterated the need for Christians to own up to our guilt in many systems of oppression in order to be part of the process of healing and wholeness. The document affirmed, and I quote, "Confession of our complicity in suffering is the starting point for true renewal that will enable us to live more just lives. Such self-critical reflection will also help us to resist the temptation to blame the poor for their poverty or those who are hurt for their wounds. It also helps us to reject the idea that God chooses some to prosper and some to suffer based on their worth or actions, and to overcome those systems of injustice we have tacitly perpetuated through silence and neutrality." Unquote. So having identified the problem, what is the response? Now, there are many aspects of this issue that's before us today, structural inequality, that I could speak to from the perspective of WCC priorities and activities, including gender inequality, systemic racism, economic inequalities and social protection, and climate and environmental injustice. But rather than skating over such a vast terrain of issues at the abstract policy level, I would rather focus on one concrete and emblematic response to the challenge of structural inequality relating especially to gender. The example I want to present is that of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians. The Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians, fostered by the WCC, is an ecumenical interfaith fellowship of African women theologians grounded in a wide range of women's realities, experiences, and faith traditions, which enables intentional intersectional reflection and engagement around women's and societal issues. It supports scholarly research by African women theologians, recognizing that while women were the majority in faith-based organizations, they were visibly absent in religious leadership and academic study of religion. The Circle has chapters in more than a dozen countries across the African continent, as well as diaspora chapters in Europe and North America. The Circle has highlighted issues related to gender, obviously, sexuality, and health, including concerns around violence against women and the HIV/AIDS epidemic. It has published over 30 books by group authorship and several single-author monographs written by Circle members. The Circle has contributed research and writing that has added immeasurably to the ecumenical movement, particularly in the area of gender justice. The Circle celebrated its 30th anniversary at its 5th Pan-African Conference last year, 2019, at the University of Botswana. The conference was held on the theme Mother Earth, Mother Africa in Religious Imagination, and was attended by scholars from some 17 countries. Keynote speaker Puleng Lenkabula added that the work of the Circle is not only acknowledged the evil of oppression in our societies, but also the injustice of colonialism of our bodies and of the earth. For Lenkabula, the Circle represents, quote, a contestation and a call for justice, but also a path that feminist and womanist theologians came to shape the narratives that were often muted in church and society, unquote. Currently, the Circle is especially concerned with the intersection between ecology, feminist theologies, HIV/AIDS, and the devastating impact of COVID-19 in Africa. Now, as we often acknowledge in these types of discussions, the essence of most religions is the idea that humanity is made, every human being is made in the likeness of God. Accordingly, to recognize the divine in the other is by definition countercultural to systemic injustice, inequality, and abuse. But for this idea to really break through the historically ingrained and entrenched patterns of privilege and inequality, a very powerful impulse is needed. In the case of the churches and religious communities, it is rare, frankly, that such an impulse can come from established leadership, products as they are of powerfully entrenched patterns and processes, though the notable exceptions are all the more admirable for that reason. But in general, it takes the self-awareness and self-assertion of the subaltern identities within a given community to make that transformative claim to equality. And that is what I think the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians represents for many of us in the ecumenical movement. To borrow the concept, the analogy that our moderator deployed and which Imam Yahya referred to, the circle is a butterfly flapping her wings and driving transformative change in our global fellowship. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prove. This is really fantastic discussion. And now I'm really pressed for time. And I would like to get from Dima exactly how much time do we have and how many questions from the chat. And I would like to remind our viewers to go ahead and send their question using the chat. And if they want to address a question to a specific speaker, to please mention the name of the speaker. And if you wish also to mention your name and your organization, that would be really great. Let's see. I think we have.
Thank you, Nawal. We still do have another 32 minutes exactly.
Yes, and how can 32 minutes and 7 speakers with a very a lot of comments and questions. Now, before I start with the question, I want to know if any of the speaker would like to finish any of their thoughts. Take a couple minutes to clarify anything before I start the round of questions. Okay, so I have a question to you, Ms. Audrey Katayagua. I was reading your biography and I'm really impressed with all your activities and, you've been able to work on. And you mentioned something about how globalization can be a fuel for religious and ethnic conflict. And I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on that, especially when we're talking about structural racism and discrimination.
Yes, thank you very much for posing that question. Basically what we have seen in the last 50 years with this whole, sweep of especially economic globalization throughout the world. Basically, the kind of globalization that I'm talking about is this form of market fundamentalism. And so in that respect, it is really a design, and especially the whole way that we have established a gross domestic production as the basis of economic well-being. But I think what we have seen actually taking place on the ground throughout the world is the fact that there are growing masses of the poor, the evaporation of the world's wealth into fewer and fewer hands, and the disappearance of the moderating fulcrum point of the middle class. As such, what you have is pretty much a predatory type of system that has come about. And so it is power over love it is competition over cooperation, and these aspects that really treat the base nature of the human being, which all religious traditions try to moderate through these sacred teachings and moral conduct and ethical behaviors and practices. But when we have this kind of dominant predatory model of economic well being that ultimately does not translate into societal, individual, and community well being, then what it does is has these consequences of fueling racial violence, as well as the consequences of that, whether it is infused in institutions, religious institutions, government institutions. And so this whole aspect is very important for us to re-examine. So it has actually helped to fuel the aspect of trying to make money over concentrating on the well being and the sharing of the love and well being of others, and to establish your dominance and your elitism and specialness in the world through this kind of value that is driven by your value as a consumer, what you own, what you can purchase, and your power through these types of modalities that I will posit to say have been created by this kind of economic infrastructure, which our wonderful guest from South Africa was trying to address. And I would coin it very simply in this entire concept of market fundamentalism that has affected all of the institutions, infrastructures, and banking, etc., that we have created, that perpetuates this kind of superiority of money as the means and expression of power, exceptionalism, and elitism. And this goes against the sacred teachings, and which says, it is easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than for a wealthy man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And while these may be, simple, fluid words, the actual meaning of it is extremely deep. And this calls upon all of our institutions, as well as all of the citizens, to really re-examine and reanalyze the kinds of economic infrastructures that we have created that brings about the most base nature of human beings that really need to be transformed.
And I would like to encourage all the speakers to please join in the discussion. Feel free to share your thoughts on the answer. Does anyone feel, that they want to comment on, the statement?
Yes, if I might just add, I think
Please.
you definitely picked up on some of the points. Absolutely, hit it on the nail in a sense. And the COVID-19 pandemic, we all thought and hoped that it would result in a transformed global financial architecture. But what we've actually seen is the rich getting richer still. We see a small elite group actually benefiting from the COVID-19 circumstance. We see governments like Denmark and Poland and a handful of European governments that tied their COVID relief packages to, they basically had an exclusion that if your company had any presence in a tax haven, then you would not be entitled to get to those COVID relief packages. But those were not adequately crafted and structured so that, again, loopholes could be used by companies to actually make money through the crisis. And I think the point that you make, Madam Kitagawa, is really, really important, that faith-based organizations need to remind these corporations, because these multinational corporations are ultimately made up of human beings, of people, many of whom are part of different faith traditions. Tax havens also exist within countries that belong to particular faith traditions. And the leaders of these faith traditions have a substantially important role in actually highlighting from a biblical, from a religious, from a faith based perspective as to why this kind of practice actually is immoral and against the basic teachings of all of our different faiths. So I would want to emphasize that absolutely. And that kind of global transformation could trickle, if anything could trickle down, that's something that could actually trickle down to ultimately addressing some of the inequalities that we see in smaller communities. So I just want to emphasize that and say that that global transformation of the international financial architecture is fundamental to the rest of the to unfolding the rest of the inequalities that we face today.
And that's really a very important point, Ms. Asha, when you talked about, the role that the money plays. And my question to you is, what can we do as individual to, be part of the solution? You mentioned that, all the trafficking and women, unfortunately, being abused and, taken advantage of because of the money that's being made, which could worsen the problem of structural racism and biases against women and generally, gender-based violence. So, is there something that our listeners can start doing? I mean, we can't take on big corporation, but is there a small thing that we can be aware of, or some tips you can recommend? Um, I'm sorry, Miss Asha, I'm not able to hear you. Dima, can you hear? Is
Sorry, I was
anybody?
sorry.
Yes, thank you
Yeah,
very
I
much.
was
Thank you,
saying that
Nawal.
Okay.
Gandhi reminded us that we all have a word in our languages. In every single language, there's a word for no. In English, we say no. In French, you say no. In Japanese, I'm not sure what you say for no, but there is a word in Arabic and in every single language for no. Um, and when I've been thinking about this at many different levels, our listeners probably comprise of we all consumers in some way or another, and we can say no as consumers. This entire system is facilitated and designed and brought together by lawyers, accountants, auditors, and different individuals in the financial sector. They can start to say no as well. But over and above that, the faith-based community and in our churches, in our mosques, in our temples, and in our meditation centers and all of that, what's really, really important is for us to begin to have the conversation. I had a conversation exactly like this yesterday, where a member of our church who invited me to somebody's home where it's a very, 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 a mansion where they were having a private mass and all of that. And I'm a very simple person. I had to have this conversation with my friend from church to remind her that I am not impressed by wealth. Wealth is not something that impresses me and that brings, makes me think, oh, this must be a very interesting and very important gathering. Far from it. When I see obscene wealth, a lot of question marks start to come up in my mind. Do they pay their taxes? What kind of company do they run? What sort of organization? How do they actually generate this kind of money? So wealth actually makes it places a lot of question marks in my mind. So as faith-based communities, as ordinary people, we need to start thinking about what's actually important in the world. And once we start changing our own lifestyles and how we actually live, we'll realize that the consumer sort of the consumerism that's pushed down our throats is not what it's not what the kingdom of God proclaims. You know, that is not that is not how the kingdom of God actually looks. So there are many different things, but I think the first and fundamental step is to actually begin to reflect upon ourselves, and then to actually find ways and find the voice to say no in a polite and a kind way, but to say no. And then finally, while the corporations might seem like monoliths that we can never address, we actually do have power, and we do need to know that we have power, and not shy away from that. So once we gather together, we can actually even address those multinationals in structural ways through advocacy. But our faith-based leaders have the strongest voice when it comes to this. They can be the ones to actually highlight what is important, what is moral, what is ethical, and what is not.
Thank you very much, Ms. Asha. I really appreciate your point of views in this matter. And I would like to remind our listeners to please go ahead to our chat section and look up the bio and see the amazing work our speakers actually have been doing. So it's quite inspiring, and their bios are already posted in the chat. I have three questions. Then I'm going to go back to Your Excellency, but my first question is to Imam Yahya. Real quickly, Imam Yahya, could you please tell me in 1 or 2 minutes maximum how the religious community, the in general, not just the Muslim, in general, the religious community, from your experience, be an advocate against racism. There's a lot of people who practice racism despite the religious teaching. What is causing this disconnect? How can we fix it?
Well, first of all, by stressing that any racial identity cannot be used or abused against another racial identity. Again, the variety and the diversity are part of the qualities of humanity. And no one should be so proud of his own identity to believe to be superior to the identity of the other. But again, this superiority should be, in religiously speaking, for any religious community, the search for piety in terms of behavior, the search for solidarity and brotherhood in terms of cooperation, but also, if I may say, as religious believers and leaders and preachers, all of our wise teachers have always taught what are the intentions of your life? What is your methodology for being and belonging to humanity? And what is at the end your goal? And the goal for all believers and citizens is, on one side, to serve a peaceful cohesion among brothers, and on the other side, to attain knowledge and to have really a complete opportunity for development. So, in order to forsake these goals, any discrimination, injustice, or greed are obstacles to any kind of service for believers and citizens. So I think that this is the core responsibility of religious believers and leaders to, in somehow, inspire this way of this vision, but also, as you were mentioning in your beginning statement, the changement. One has to have the intellectual honesty to search a interior and exterior changement rather than closing himself in his own agenda or ideology or superiority or victimization. So I think there is really an effort on our souls and our minds that has to be taught by religious leaders in cooperation with institutional and secular governments. So that's another methodology. We have to work with as part of the civil society, with experts, with teachers, with jurists, but also with governments and institutions, and respect the different grammars of a secular government, of a social scientist, but also of a philosopher and a theologian.
Thank you so much, Imam Yahya. My question is to you, Lisa, and if you can talk specifically about the role of empowering women and specifically more representation and gender-based empowerment for female, especially. What do you think some of the work that we did right, what we can do better, or where we can improve? Um, Lisa Winter.
Thank you for your question, Nawal. I think there is, of course, a lot of things you can do, and it depends on a little bit where you want to start and which sectors you want to focus on. In my work, we have been focusing on how freedom of religion belief intersects with gender equality, and also how religiously motivated discrimination and violations of freedom of religion belief affects women in different ways. And of course, there are numerous of different issues, both structural and economic and social, and within religious communities themselves. So I think you can start in many ways. I mean, one way is to open up religious communities for debates and discussions on these issues, how to deal with women and women's roles, and let them to have a more say in the way they want to live out their lives and their faiths and their beliefs, and involve them in interpreting their religions and finding their ways to express it, and of course also to see how the religious identities of women intersects with other issues that are involved in this multi-layered discrimination that many women faces. For example, how an ethnic minority woman also belonging to a religious minority faces numerous challenges that not might be obvious for other people belonging to the majority. For example, the fear of abduction among religious minorities, that their girls will be abducted, hinders them to enjoy the freedom of movement, because then their community rather thinks it's better that they stay home instead of going to school, because then they might be abducted or kidnapped or sexually harassed on their way to school. Therefore, their right to education and their right to freedom of movement is also affected because of the fear of being abducted because they belong to a religious vulnerable minority.
Yes, that's really make a lot of sense. So, and that will lead to the question to you, Mr. Peter Proof. Can you please discuss briefly in 1 or 2 minutes how can we hold our religious institution accountable? I really liked your courage when you started with the confession. So, with confession comes, what's next? Accountability. The floor is yours.
Well, I mean, I think for us in the World Council of Churches, as a fellowship of member churches around the world who come from very different traditions and very different cultural contexts, I think it's important for us to try and establish a baseline of common understanding that is fundamentally based upon key faith principles, biblical principles. And I mentioned one of those, Imago Dei, that all people are created in the image of God, without distinction. And this is a given. In principle, every church in our constituency acknowledges and accepts that principle. But it is poorly reflected in our structures and processes, evidently. And that's why we have a program in the WCC called A Just Community of Women and Men, a transversal, designed to be a cross-cutting program covering all areas of our work, not just our advocacy for human rights, not just our other aspects that you might most closely associate that with, but everything: theological education, evangelism, etc., etc. All these areas have to be infused with a gender analysis, a gender lens. And that's our objective in the WCC, to bring that to bear. And that's why I profiled also this initiative, the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians. It's not a program of the WCC, but it has emerged from that process of encouragement and empowerment. And I think the most important thing that religious leaders, the formal religious leaders in the official religious leadership positions can do, is to be open to such movements within their communities, not to suppress them, but to allow them to flourish and to let those subaltern identities identify themselves and assert themselves.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Prove. I really appreciate your answer. And Your Excellency, can you please, or how can the United Nations Action Plan to Prevent Genocide support prevention of discrimination and support values of equality?
Your Excellency, I think your microphone is muted. Could you please unmute yourself?
Sorry.
We hear you very well. Thank you.
I wanted to say that before I address your question, today the Secretary General issued a statement on corruption in the context of COVID-19, and reminding us that corruption is criminal, immoral, and the ultimate betrayal of public trust. And as we all know, be it in Asia, in Africa, in all parts of the world, we have witnessed corruption taking place in the process of producing and also supplying medicine, tests, etc., masks and whatever. And this is simply unacceptable. And that is where I do believe, as Audrey Kitagawa mentioned it, when she referred to two aspects, power and law. First, and then you have competition, rather partnership. And I think this is very important, because ultimately, to bring to an end inequalities, to bring to an end discrimination, which is the key principle when we speak about human rights. And I always say, people, don't forget that human rights is a legal framework. It's not simply a word, it's a legal framework. And these are obligations by states, and we need to make sure, ultimately, that more and more we witness strong collaborations between religious groups, women, young people, young organizations, to serve as first responders. Because one thing we have learned with this COVID is that the expression of solidarity, which has been displayed by FBOs, by religious leaders, I can say almost has no precedent. And we need, therefore, to capitalize on this momentum so as to ensure the promotion of a strong interfaith solidarity during such intense as we have seen, to not stop with this crisis, but to go beyond. We need to build a new world. And either we like it or not, we have to build a new world. A world which will be based on principles and values, which unfortunately we have seen leaders around this world ignoring those principles and those values. We need to reconcile with those principles, with those values, which are the foundation of the United Nations, so as to make our world a world of peace. And we don't have the choice. We don't have the choice. We are seeing a growing population, And we are seeing also these conflicts still going on. We are seeing violence against the woman. This has to stop. And we have the capacity to stop it if we decide to get together. And one of the colleague panelists mentioned it clearly. It's not about your religion, my religion. It's about humanity. It's about humanity. And we all know that these religions share those same values. Let's strengthen the partnership. Let's make sure that we can reach the most affected communities, as we have seen, like in my country here in Senegal. We have seen recently in Egypt. We have seen it in Kenya, elsewhere. So let's build on this momentum. Let's not accept to be defeated. Let's confront those extreme right wing who are now building their international from United States to New Zealand in Europe. Let's make sure that we are here to remind them that they are part of the same body, this humanity. So, as I said, once again, let's not stop with the words. Let's engage all these co-organizers of this forum, that the G20 forums should aim towards action. And I think for the next forum, it will be extremely helpful to see what has been done in each of the regions around the world. How you get together to at least implement even a small part of the ideas, the recommendation which will come out of this forum. And for the plan of action, well, there are already many FBOs, many religious leaders engaged. And the last one was the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar. When I met with him, he agreed to include the framework into the curricula for the training, not only of the Imam, but also of the students in Al-Azhar, because prevention is a collective responsibility. So I hope that in the other groups also, the other religious leaders will take the framework which they, in fact, developed. That is their framework. So as to put it further down at the grassroots level, so everyone be familiarized with this idea of prevention. And with this, once again, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I have 3 questions and 3 minutes. I see the 3 questions are from the chat. Probably Dima can correct me if I'm wrong. We only have 3 minutes, but she's the timekeeper. So my question to Dr. Ganon, I would like to know what women and marginalized people can do themselves to make their voice heard and help themselves at grassroots level.
Well, I think to use every platform, and I think this, the meeting, even this one that is happening here in the framework of the G20 and other settings, of course, we talked about the UN, but I think it is extremely important to to help people heal from ancient categories. We are talking, for example, about race and racism. The concept of race has to be deconstructed. It was first used in the 16th century. Now, when we think about it, right? 16th century, and then basically it was promoted by European naturalists and anthropologists from when we think about the publication by a Swedish naturalist in the 18th century. So this is pretty recent, but it has been erected as a doctrine, a doctrinal system actually in 1853. But supremacist ideologies co-opted this idea to now use it with power structures. And I think it's extremely important that people start deconstructing in their minds these false concept. There is one humanity, there is one human family. If there is no, if this is not integrated, there will not be solidarity. We will still competing, whether at the cultural, social, religious level. So, and the same thing with the issue of gender equality. women, and this is the new challenge of our world, to accept the full humanity of women. Basically, you see, we were talking. The pandemic of racism is bringing to the fore the necessity to consider Black people as full human beings. So the same thing is true for women, full human being. I think this is one of the core problems that our world has been wrestling with. So I will say using every platform in order to help re-educate, to help re-socialize, to help people embrace the so-called religious values that they adhere to. And I think this is a global education. Of course, there are a lot of forums where this is happening, and faith-based organizations can really make a great contribution in restoring the dignity of every human being. And then, and when I say every human being, regardless of color, gender, etc. So I think, yes, using every platform in order to re-educate, re-socialize, and basically help people embrace what makes us all human. And as I said earlier, all these religions, when we think about it, promote, compassion and then solidarity. But again, love, sacrificial love, and the consideration of other human beings as sacred, and I insist on this point, is extremely important. So, like in January, we'll be having an event in New York about gender equality. Again, using every platform in order to help people embrace the whole human family.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Dr. Ganoon. I have a question for Lisa, but I want to check with the timekeeper. Dima, can you please let me know if we have a time for one more question for Lisa?
If Lisa may promise for 2 more minutes, we have the time, of course.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Lisa, there is a question in the chat from Asma. I'm trying to see Asma Keftaro. And the question is, it would be great if you may elaborate further on the freedom of belief precisely with on women discrimination in relation to freedom of belief. This is the question to you, Lisa, from Asma.
Thank you. Could you read the question once again, Nawal?
Sure, absolutely. It would be great if you may elaborate further on the freedom of belief, precisely with women discrimination.
Okay.
On women
I mean,
discrimination.
it's a question that is really difficult to elaborate precisely on within a couple of few minutes because it's a very complex issue. But I would rather than like to refer you to some good reports that could help you to dig into this topic if you want to know more. There is a report called it's called Promoting Freedom of Religion, Belief and Gender Equality in the Context of the Sustainable Development Goals. You can download it on the website of the Danish Institute of Human Rights. It's a result of an expert consultation that was partly coordinated by us and other actors last year with experts on health, access to justice and education, and women's rights and freedom of religion belief, looking on discrimination against women in the light of freedom of religion belief, gender equality, and 3 SDGs. That's a really interesting report if you want to know more about it. The special rapporteur on freedom of religion belief also wrote his last report this spring on the intersectionality between gender equality and freedom of religion belief. And there you can also find a lot of more examples and concrete points that you can read about more than that I can say in these few minutes. So I would really encourage you to look into these 2 reports if you want to know more.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And to you, Audrey, real quick question from Eduardo. What is the name of the initiative that Miss Audrey was referring to? So he's asking you to name the initiative, please.
The initiative that I began the conversation with It was a joint call by the Parliament of the World's Religions. And you can go to any of the websites of the organizations that I am naming right now. The Parliament of the World's Religions, United Religions Initiative, Religions for Peace, as well as the Interfaith Center of New York. So go to our websites and you will be able to see that joint call. It is a statement against racism. A very important action call to all religious communities to be able to get engaged here, now, on the ground, and wherever you may be. So it's very, very important that we find these ways to become engaged where we are, because where we are is the holy ground, and we must find God there. And as a final closing statement, I really wanted to be able to share this beautiful saying by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who said, "Someday, after mastering the winds, the waves, the tides, and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love, and then, for a second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire." So thank you so much.
And with that, we will conclude our discussion today. It has been absolutely my pleasure and honor to work with you today. Thank you very much to our distinguished speakers. Thank you, KAICIID. Thank you to all of our listeners, people who are chatting. Let's keep this conversation going online. I would like to hand over this to Dima as we conclude the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Nawal. Thank you, all dear speakers, for your inspiring and insightful remarks in this session. Also, thank you, Nawal, once again, for your great moderation and the rich discussion. I join each and every one of you in the importance of working towards, gender equality and against structural discrimination. And it's very, very important topic that, unfortunately, 2 hours were never enough. We highly appreciate your remarks, and also I would like to extend our gratitude to our dear audience for their active and rich engagement in the discussion. There have been a lot of comments and a lot of engagement over the chat, and unfortunately time allowed only for a few questions. I also would like to remind our participants to fill in the evaluation forms that were shared over the chat. It's very important, and we appreciate your efforts in that. Last but not least, I would like to ask also participants and all the audience to join us during the 4th day of the G20 Interfaith Forum tomorrow, Friday, the 16th of October. In the 4th day, we will focus on the issues of climate change and the role of religious leaders in this context, with a plenary session followed by 3 panel discussions to delve deeper into this topic. We thank you all once again for your valuable participation, and dear speakers and dear moderator, thank you so much for your time, experience, insightful remarks. Look forward to connect with you all soon again, and wishing you a very good evening or morning or remaining of the day. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.